Sitting almost 12,000 feet above sea level, Lhasa Gongar Airport does something that almost no other runway on Earth has to deal with. It forces every single commercial jet that lands there to give something up: payload, range, or in a lot of cases, both at once. There's simply no cheating physics at that altitude. Western plane makers already tried to solve this exact puzzle decades ago, and nearly every one of them walked away from it with a canceled program, a handful of unsold airframes, and a very expensive lesson nobody wanted to repeat. Now, China is stepping right back into that same puzzle, on purpose, with its eyes wide open to the history behind it. On July the 29th, 2026, a jet called the C919-600 lifted off from a runway in Shanghai and quietly completed its very first test flight. And in doing so, it marked one of the most significant milestones yet in China's long-running push to break into the global aircraft business. So here's the real question worth sitting with for a moment. Is COMAC about to walk straight into one of aviation's oldest and most expensive mistakes? Or have they actually found a completely different set of rules to play by? Rules that let them win a game that already defeated Boeing once before? Let's dig into it properly, piece by piece. First, let's nail down exactly what happened in the sky above Shanghai that morning, because the details matter more than you'd expect. The aircraft, carrying the registration B002U, departed from Shanghai Pudong International Airport at 7:59 in the morning, local time. It didn't head anywhere near Tibet, and it didn't head toward any mountain range at all. Instead, it flew a wide, controlled loop just to the northeast of the city, climbing to a maximum recorded altitude of roughly 22,000 feet. To put that in perspective, that's basically cruising height for a small regional turboprop. Nowhere close to the thin, oxygen-starved air this aircraft was actually engineered from the ground up to survive in. 1 hour and 59 minutes later, at 9:58 in the morning, it touched back down at Pudong, right where it started. COMAC's official statement afterward was short, almost understated for a milestone this significant, simply confirming that the aircraft had completed every scheduled test point planned for that particular flight. At this point, you might reasonably be wondering why a plane specifically built for high-altitude operations would spend its very first flight over a flat coastal city hundreds of miles away from any real mountain. The answer is simple once you think about it. This flight was never meant to prove that the aircraft could handle thin air. Its entire purpose was far more basic than that. It was designed to confirm that the fundamentals actually worked as expected. Things like the engines spooling up correctly, the flight control systems responding the way engineers predicted on paper, how the entire airframe behaved under calm, low-risk, sea-level conditions where any problem could be caught and corrected safely. The genuine high-altitude trials, the ones actually designed to replicate the brutal, thin, cold conditions of the Tibetan Plateau, are still somewhere further down the road. This first flight was simply the opening rung of a much longer ladder, and as it turns out, that ladder has been under construction for a very long time already, far longer than most people realize. The physical prototype rolled out of COMAC's factory back in January 2026. From that point forward, it went through months of methodical ground testing, taxi trials up and down the runway, high-speed braking tests to make sure the aircraft could stop safely under load, endless systems verification checks running through every subsystem again and again, all steadily building toward the actual flight that finally happened last week. But rewind even further back, and you'll discover that COMAC's groundwork for this entire program started long before the prototype itself ever existed in metal. Back in September 2024, the company flew a completely standard, unmodified C919 directly into Lhasa Gongar itself, purely to gather real-world performance data at an elevation of 3,570 meters. Long before they had even finalized the design of the shortened high-altitude variant. In other words, this specific aircraft program has quietly been in development for close to 2 full years before it ever left the ground on its own first flight. What happened over Shanghai last week wasn't a finish line by any stretch. It was the opening move in a much longer game. Let's talk for a second about just how unforgiving Lhasa Gongar actually is, because until you understand the numbers, none of the engineering decisions that follow really make sense. Most major commercial airports around the world sit somewhere close to sea level within a few hundred feet either way. Denver, often cited as a famously high airport in the United States, sits at about 5,400 feet. Lhasa Gongar sits at nearly 11,700 feet, more than twice that altitude. And it isn't some minor regional strip either. It's a full-scale international airport serving one of the most remote, mountainous, and strategically important regions on the planet. At that height, runway length alone can't fully compensate for the thinner air. Engines produce noticeably less thrust, wings generate noticeably less lift, and pilots have far less margin for error if anything goes wrong during takeoff or landing. At extreme temperature swings, unpredictable mountain winds, and terrain that surrounds the runway on multiple sides, and you start to understand why so few manufacturers have ever seriously attempted to build a dedicated aircraft for this kind of environment. It's not simply a hard market. It's a genuinely hard flying environment, full stop, and that's precisely why any manufacturer willing to seriously tackle it needs both patience and a very specific kind of long-term motivation. Which brings us directly to the real engineering question sitting at the heart of this whole story. What exactly did COMAC have to change about a perfectly normal, successful airliner to turn it into a jet capable of surviving up there, at nearly 12,000 feet, where the air itself is fighting against every takeoff? Here's where things get genuinely interesting, and honestly, a little counterintuitive. To make the C919 600 viable at that kind of altitude, COMAC didn't bolt anything extra onto the airframe. They didn't add bigger engines, bigger wings, or some exotic new system. They actually stripped something away instead. Engineers physically removed 6 entire fuselage frames from the standard C919 design, cutting straight into the plane's structural skeleton, the ribs that give the fuselage its shape and strength. That single dramatic change shortened the fuselage by about 6 meters, bringing the aircraft's total length down to roughly 34 meters overall, noticeably shorter than the standard version rolling off the same production line. Think of it like a mountaineer ruthlessly emptying every single non-essential item out of their pack before attempting a serious summit push. Less weight on your back directly translates into a bigger safety margin once the air itself starts working against you instead of helping you. That one structural decision has a direct and completely unavoidable consequence. Passenger capacity drops from around 164 seats on the standard C919 down to somewhere between 140 and 160 seats on the shortened 600 variant, depending on the specific cabin configuration an airline chooses. And here's exactly why that trade-off matters so much more than it might first appear. At an elevation of 3,270 meters, the air is roughly a third thinner than it is down at sea level. A heavier aircraft simply cannot generate enough lift to get airborne safely in that kind of thin air, no matter how much raw thrust its engines are capable of producing on paper. Physics doesn't negotiate, so COMAC made a very deliberate, calculated trade. Fewer seats, less revenue collected on every single flight, in direct exchange for enough performance headroom to actually operate safely and reliably at that brutal altitude. On paper, at least, that solves the engineering side of the equation. But it immediately opens up a much bigger, much more uncomfortable question, because COMAC is far from the first manufacturer in aviation history to attempt exactly this kind of trade-off. And it's worth pointing out that shortening the fuselage wasn't the only lever COMAC could have pulled. Other manufacturers facing this same problem have experimented with upgraded engines, modified wing designs, and even reduced fuel loads on specific high-altitude routes to buy back performance. COMAC appears to be leaning primarily on the structural approach first, cutting weight directly out of the airframe, likely because it's the most predictable and controllable variable in the entire equation. Engines can be swapped or upgraded later down the line. Aerodynamic tweaks can be refined over successive years of flight testing. But a shorter, lighter fuselage delivers an immediate, guaranteed, and permanent reduction in weight from day one. And that kind of certainty matters enormously when you're trying to convince a cautious regulator and an equally cautious airline that this aircraft can be trusted to operate safely at altitude, flight after flight, for decades to come. This idea, shortening a successful jet to buy back altitude performance, has been tried before, more than once, and the track record isn't exactly encouraging. The McDonnell Douglas DC-920, the Boeing 707-220, and the BAC 111-475 were all shortened, high-altitude capable versions of aircraft that were otherwise perfectly successful, well-regarded jets in their own right. All 3 of these programs existed specifically to solve the same thin air problem the C919 600 is tackling right now, decades later, on the other side of the world. And all 3 of them failed, not because the engineering didn't work, because it did. These were technically sound aircraft. They failed because the market for them simply never materialized the way anyone hoped. Airlines were not willing to permanently sacrifice payload capacity and fuel efficiency across their entire fleet just to gain a performance boost they would only actually need on a small handful of specific routes, a few times a day at most. Each of those 3 specialized programs sold only a modest number of units before quietly fading out of production entirely, forgotten footnotes in the history of their respective manufacturers. The market for a highly specialized aircraft like this is inherently thin by its very nature, and that's precisely what makes it specialized in the first place. It's worth sitting with just how thoroughly those 3 earlier programs disappeared from public memory. The Boeing 707-220 was built specifically with Braniff Airways in mind, targeting hot, high-altitude airports in South America, where the standard 707 simply couldn't operate with a full payload. Boeing built only a handful of them before quietly folding the variant back into the rest of the 707 lineup. The McDonnell Douglas DC-920 was developed for Scandinavian Airlines to handle short, tricky runways in Scandinavia, and it saw an even smaller production run before fading out entirely. The BSE 111-475 tried to serve a similar niche for hot and high operators, and it too struggled to ever build meaningful volume. None of these aircraft were failures in a technical sense. Pilots who flew them generally liked them. The problem was always the same one, over and over again. A specialized aircraft built for a narrow slice of the market, sold to a global customer base that mostly didn't need that narrow slice at all. So here's the question sitting right underneath this entire story, the one that really matters. If three separate Western manufacturers, each with enormous engineering resources and deep aviation experience, already lost real money chasing this exact same idea, why on earth would anyone expect a Chinese, state-backed program to end up with a different result this time around? It turns out the answer has surprisingly little to do with the overall size of the global market. It actually comes down entirely to what each of these programs needed in order to be considered a genuine success in the first place. Western manufacturers, operating inside publicly traded, shareholder-driven companies, needed a genuinely global customer base to make the math work. Enough airlines flying enough routes across enough countries to spread out the enormous upfront cost of engineering an entirely new variant from scratch. Those programs needed to turn a profit purely on their own individual merits, completely independent of anything else happening elsewhere in the company's broader product lineup. If the international sales numbers simply didn't add up after a few years, there was no other business justification left for the program to keep existing. So, one by one, the programs were quietly shut down and the tooling was scrapped. COMAC may not be bound by that exact same rule at all, and that difference could end up being the whole story here. A high-altitude variant doesn't necessarily need to sell hundreds of jets across the entire globe to justify its own existence, not if its real underlying purpose is something else entirely. Things like replacing imported foreign aircraft on strategically important domestic routes that China genuinely needs to keep running, guaranteeing reliable, dependable air connectivity to a politically sensitive and remote region of the country, and quietly building up manufacturing know-how and flight test experience that COMAC can then reuse across its entire growing aircraft lineup for decades to come. Under that kind of framework, success doesn't depend on winning the global commercial market at all, at least not right away. It depends on winning at home first, and everything else becomes a bonus on top of that. If you want to keep following exactly how China is systematically building out an entire aviation industry that goes far beyond just this one aircraft, stick around and subscribe, because the C919 600 is genuinely only one small piece of a much bigger, much more ambitious strategy. And here's exactly how that broader strategy is already playing out in practice, right now, in the real world. The launch customer for this entire program is Zhejiang Airlines, formerly known as Tibet Airlines, which committed to purchasing 40 units of the C919 600 back at the 2024 Singapore Air Show, a full 2 years before this specific aircraft ever actually left the ground for a test flight. Stop and think about what that actually means for a second. That's not just a purchase order quietly sitting on someone's desk. That's an entire airline effectively signing a mortgage on a house that, at the time the ink dried, existed only as engineering blueprints and computer models. So how exactly does an airline commit to 40 aircraft that don't even physically exist yet, with no completed prototype and no test flight data to reference? That's genuinely a fascinating story on its own, and I've actually covered exactly how Zhejiang Airlines locked in that unusual deal in a separate video linked right up above, and it's well worth watching immediately after this one. But here's the short version for now. Zhejiang isn't simply buying the finished aircraft off a showroom floor once it's certified. They're actively feeding COMAC years of real, hard-won operational flight data gathered from actually flying commercial routes across the brutal Tibetan plateau. The kind of deep operational insight that virtually no outside manufacturer could ever easily replicate on their own from a design office thousands of miles away. That is a genuine advantage the DC-920 and the 707-220 never had access to back in their day. A launch customer actively helping shape and refine the aircraft's design before it ever came into physical existence. It also helps to understand just how tightly connected Zhejiang Airlines already is to the region this aircraft is built for. The airline has been flying into Tibet's handful of high-altitude airports for years, using a mixed fleet of Airbus jets, gaining exactly the kind of accumulated operational experience, from engine wear patterns to runway performance in extreme cold, that most airlines never have to think about at all. Handing that accumulated knowledge over to COMAC essentially turns Zhejiang into an unofficial extension of the engineering team, feeding real flight data back into a program that, for any Western manufacturer attempting the same thing from scratch, would have taken years of expensive dedicated flight trials to gather independently. That's the kind of quiet structural advantage that doesn't show up in a press release, but it may end up mattering more than almost anything else in this entire story. So, does any of this mean COMAC has already won this whole thing? Not even remotely close. And before we get into exactly why, take a moment to think back to those three earlier manufacturers we just talked about, the ones who tried this exact same idea decades ago and still ended up losing money on it, despite having enormous resources behind them. Do you genuinely believe a state-backed program is actually capable of breaking that long, consistent historical pattern? Or is COMAC simply walking straight into the same expensive trap that eventually swallowed all three of its predecessors? Drop your honest thoughts down in the comments below. I'll personally be reading through them and pinning the best answers I find. There are really three completely distinct things this program still has to prove, and it's remarkably easy to blur all three of them together into one vague, feel-good notion of overall success. The first is technical success, meaning the aircraft can actually operate safely and reliably in real-world conditions at places like Lhasa Gongar, something that genuinely has not been tested at all yet, not even once. The second is operational success, meaning an airline can realistically fly this aircraft every single day on a tight schedule without the program quietly turning into a constant, expensive maintenance headache behind the scenes. And the third is commercial success, meaning enough additional customers beyond just the one launch airline eventually come forward and place their own orders to make building out this entire specialized variant genuinely worthwhile for COMAC in the first place. Right now, today, the C919-600 has only cleared exactly one of those three bars, and even that one only partially. It has flown exactly once, at sea level in calm and controlled conditions, nowhere close to the punishing environment it was actually designed to operate within. COMAC hasn't announced any kind of firm certification timeline for the variant yet. The baseline C919 itself still doesn't hold ESA or FAA certification, which keeps the entire program locked out of Western markets entirely, regardless of how well this particular variant eventually ends up performing at altitude. And right now, at this exact moment, there's exactly one confirmed customer on the books worldwide. That is still the exact same historical pattern that needs to be decisively broken, and one successful, cautious test flight over a flat coastal city simply doesn't break it on its own. What it does mean, realistically, is that COMAC has now earned itself a genuine, credible chance to actually try. Zoom out a little further, though, and it quickly becomes clear that the C919-600 was never really conceived as some isolated, standalone side project. COMAC is simultaneously developing a stretched, larger version of the same basic airframe, called the C919-800, seating somewhere around 210 passengers, currently being developed in close partnership with China Eastern Airlines, and targeted to enter commercial service sometime around 2030. Put both of these variants side by side for a moment, and what you're really looking at isn't just one clever aircraft anymore. It's the deliberate beginning of an entire aircraft family, spanning roughly 140 to 210 seats, depending on configuration, built using essentially the exact same strategic playbook Airbus famously used decades ago when it built out its hugely successful A319 through A321 family. A specialized high-altitude performer sitting at one end of the lineup, a larger, more mainstream, higher capacity jet sitting comfortably at the other end. Two very different operational problems being solved using fundamentally the same core airframe and shared manufacturing infrastructure underneath. And crucially, the domestic math underpinning this entire strategy is very real, not just wishful state-backed thinking. Roughly 25 of the world's approximately 60 total high-altitude airports are located inside China's own borders. On a purely global scale, that's obviously not a massive market by any conventional measure. It's honestly barely even a meaningful niche by normal international aviation standards. But it is precisely the kind of concentrated, largely captive domestic network that a well-funded, state-backed manufacturer can realistically build an entire viable business case around, long before a single unit of this aircraft ever needs to be sold to an overseas customer to justify the program's existence. It's also worth remembering why Airbus, specifically, has quietly dominated this exact niche for so long without ever facing any real competition. The Airbus A319, in certain high-altitude configurations, has effectively been the default aircraft of choice for airlines flying into places like Lhasa, La Paz, and other extreme elevation airports around the world for years, largely because nobody else seriously bothered to compete for that particular slice of the market. Boeing walked away from the space decades ago after the 707-220 underperformed commercially, and it never seriously returned. That left Airbus with an unusually comfortable, largely uncontested position in a small but strategically important corner of global aviation, one that quietly generates loyalty and repeat orders from a handful of airlines operating in the world's most demanding terrain. COMAC entering that same space doesn't threaten Airbus's core narrow-body business built around the A320 family. But it does threaten one very specific, very defensible pocket of business that Airbus has enjoyed almost entirely to itself for a very long time. None of this, to be completely clear, makes the C919-600 an immediate global threat to Airbus or Boeing's core business. Not yet, and probably not for a good while still to come. But it does signal something genuinely worth paying close, sustained attention to over the next few years. Airbus, in particular, may be quietly at risk of eventually losing the one specific corner of the commercial aviation map it has, up until now, held almost entirely to itself without any serious competition, and it could ultimately end up losing that ground to a program that right now is only just barely getting off the ground, quite literally, with a single test flight over a coastal city. Because here's the thing worth remembering about first steps in aviation history. The DC-920 and the 707 and 220 never actually got a real, meaningful second chance to properly prove themselves once the market turned against them. The market killed both of those programs off relatively quickly, well before their stories ever had the chance to properly unfold or mature. The C919 600, by clear contrast, just completed its very first flight with a committed launch customer already locked in 2 years earlier, a larger sister aircraft family already actively in development alongside it, and a genuine domestic market that appears almost purpose-built for exactly this kind of specialized altitude-capable aircraft. That is genuinely further than any of its ill-fated Western predecessors ever managed to get, even in their best years. Whether all of that eventually translates into real, lasting commercial success still comes down entirely to everything we just walked through together in detail: full certification, proven day-to-day reliability, and actual sustained operations up at extreme altitude over years, not just months. But if COMAC manages to clear those remaining, genuinely difficult bars one by one, this quiet, understated early morning test flight over Shanghai won't end up being remembered as some minor footnote buried deep in aviation history. It will instead be remembered as the exact moment the real story actually began. And there's actually a second major C919 story breaking this exact same month, running in parallel with everything we just covered. The standard version of the aircraft, the unmodified variant, is about to fly its very first ever scheduled international route, stepping onto the world stage in a completely different way. I've already put together the full story on that development as well, including exactly where that new route is headed and what it means for COMAC's broader ambitions, in the video appearing on your screen right now. See you over there.